every feature of culture that I want to talk about has a historical explanation for how it got there. And it's a historical explanation that doesn't imply anyone is to blame, right? I mean, the problem here is that people feel you're blaming victims by invoking cultural explanations. This is not what I'm doing. Blame is a totally irrelevant. Totally irrelevant to this conversation. Like no one is to blame for the culture that they accidentally were born into. No one chooses where they're born. No one chooses the values that are inculcated on mother's knee. None of like choice and blame are totally irrelevant to this picture.
Can you give me a little bit of background on yourself, how you got to this point?
I'm from New Jersey. I'm from a suburb in New Jersey, and I guess I started caring about ideas and writing in a way that was extracurricular maybe when I was 17. And since then I tried to sort of start my own blog talking about some of the issues I talk about today. And my views evolved over that period. I used to be pretty much on the left, perhaps on the far left, politically, especially on the topic of race. Mm-hmm. And I was coming into my own just at the time when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson and Black Lives Matter was blowing up, and I was very moved by that. And I very much identified with that upsurge of enthusiasm around Black identity politics, and slowly I came away from those views and ended up seeing identity politics as problematic in many ways. And eventually I started writing a lot just on my own, not necessarily publishing. And eventually I submitted a piece to Quillette I think in April of this year, and started writing for them, and those pieces got widely circulated. Mm-hmm. So
that's how I found out about you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you said the first time you published with them was in 2017? Last year, you said?
No, it was actually this year.
Oh, wow.
It was what happened was, you remember Kanye West tweeted, "I love the way Candace Owens stinks."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when he did that was such a profound moment for me, for mainly because there's this huge socially enforced taboo in the Black community around politics and around political parties, right? You can disagree on a wide range of issues, but you can't say anything nice about a conservative or a Republican without being seen as playing for the wrong team racially, so to speak. And I have many issues with the way Candace Owens frames issues. I think Kanye subsequently said many ignorant things. But the reason that moment moved me was because there is this huge taboo around free thinking politically in the Black community in a way that there isn't necessarily in other racial groups. And I felt that someone with Kanye's platform is uniquely placed to shatter that taboo, despite the disagreements I might have with him or Candace. So I was inspired at that moment to write something about this, because it's so rare that you see something like this happen, a prominent Black celebrity endorsing a right-wing pundit. So yeah, that's really what got me writing.
What was it that you said that you changed? You used to have a very left mindset, mm-hmm. and then it changed. Mm-hmm. When did that change, and how?
It's hard to pinpoint any specific moment, but I do remember when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson. I remember talking about this and just taking for granted that this was obviously an instance of police brutality, and that it was symptomatic of the fact that America's criminal justice system is rigged against Black people. And that this is just of a piece with America's brutal history of racial terror. I remember just taking for granted that that was true and that this was further evidence of that. And I think I mentioned, maybe I had some conversations eventually with people who disagreed. And it was so shocking because I had never talked. I mean, I think I met one Republican in my entire upbringing, right? I'm from a very liberal bubble.
Any race, just one.
Of any race.
Wow.
Yes. It was a fifth grade teacher. But that should give you a sense of the degree to which I and many people who grew up in similar contexts were ideologically isolated, only hearing a very narrow range of perspectives. So to actually disagree with someone on a topic like police violence, this is probably when I'm 18, and to notice that the person I'm disagreeing with isn't evil and isn't racist, because I know this person, for example. That helped shift things for me, because I just realized I had never heard the other side presented charitably. The only version of the other side I had heard was probably the occasional 30-second Fox News clip where someone who was really a hack in many ways, giving the weakest possible argument from the other side. So in my mind, up till that point, that was the whole other side. It was just Sean Hannity in his worst moments. So part of it is just meeting people who disagree and talking to them. Part of it is hearing the arguments against my positions by listening to podcasts and reading books. I do remember another moment that was formative for me was this guy, John McWhorter, who I've since come to know, but who I didn't know who he was at the time. He's a writer, has written a lot on race issues, taking similar positions that I'm now taking, who teaches at Columbia University, where I go. And I just went to the library and sort of on a whim took out the first book that they had by him, and it was called Authentically Black. And he was writing, the general thesis, it's a collection of essays, but the general thesis is that there is this social taboo in the Black community, this enforced conformity where you come under the shadow of being, quote, not Black enough if you dissent politically, if you suggest reasons for Blacks lagging behind on various indicators of success that aren't narrowly the fault of modern day white people. If you're willing to break that taboo, you're viewed as inauthentically Black, right? As selling out in some sense. This was the main theme of that book, and it was so obviously true when I read it, but I didn't realize that this was the type of thing that could be said in public, because I'd never heard a Black person say this. And but at the same time, it was so true it was obviously true once it was said. And I remember just that being an important moment too.
So how was it for you when you started to change your views? Because you say that you were in a bubble. I imagine, I mean, obviously you're public now, but before then, when you started to change, did you get any, flack for that from friends or family or anyone in your inner circle?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, these are. I mean, the irony is that many of the views I have can be expressed in private, but you get a unique amount of blowback for saying them publicly. This is another actually point that John McWhorter had made in that same book, which is that like there are all these poll results showing that the idea that systemic racism is a primary obstacle for Black people now is actually a minority viewpoint in the Black community.
Really?
Yes, there's one from Pew that found 60% of Black people without college degrees saying that race has played no factor. Race has not been a factor at all in their success or failure in life. There's another one by Gallup that found 60% of Black people saying bias is not an issue in housing, jobs, and other avenues of life. There's this Harvard sociologist, Ethan Foss, who's done extensive polling of the Black community and found that the idea that that the system is stacked against black people is shared by maybe 30% at most of the black underclass. We're talking about people who don't have jobs, aren't in school. The majority of them think the system is basically fair when polled. So, so one of John McWhorter's points is that just, at the average barbecue of a black family, the kinds of takes that I have are not anathema, right? But there's this idea that you can't articulate this where white people are around to hear, because the well-being of black people in America is so dependent on white people feeling guilty and feeling on the hook. I think that was the second part of his thesis in that book, and I think it is true. So, yeah, I've gotten significant blowback from some people talking to even privately. I've gotten into some very nasty and very, very bitter conversations. But in general, I find face-to-face conversations tend to go better than they go online.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
I do want to talk to you more about that, especially regarding the media. But while we're talking about kind of this experience that you're going through, how has it been now that you have been more public, that now that your pieces on Quillette have been kind of blowing up, which is great? How's that been for you?
Well, the only way I've experienced it is through what I get online, which is a mixed bag. It's a lot of compliments and a lot of very, very angry comments as well. But in real life, in real life, I almost only get fans coming up to me, right? Because, when's the last time you went up to a writer that you really hate and said, "Hi, my name is," and I hate your guts, right? Because most socially normal human beings don't do that face to face. You have to be really antisocial to go up to someone you just meeting and tell them how much of.
Some people get that though. I see some of these guys.
And
they're I guess a little bit bigger, a little bit louder. I think like Ben Shapiro, whoever. Yeah. Like they for sure, get some flack. So.
Right. Yeah, I guess Ben Shapiro's on a very different level of being known than I am, and he has I think a bit of a more combative personality to begin with. So I can imagine that's true. Yeah.
But back what you were saying about kind of the perception that, the majority of the black community thinks a certain way or feels a certain way, and you saying that that's not necessarily true. Why do you think it is? And, a lot of your pieces, you have so many statistics, facts, and from what I can tell, all of your sources are very public and mainstream. Why do you think more mainstream journalists aren't having the same findings or reporting the same things?
Well, I think a number of reasons. I guess the consequences for someone to point out these things, no matter how mainstream these poll results are, no matter how easy they are to find on the internet, the fact that I guess it's just you come under the shadow, like I said, of being a sellout. Yeah, I don't know exactly why that is the case, but it's something that just perpetuates itself at this point. What happens is that black intellectuals who do more or less believe that systemic racism is a primary obstacle to upward mobility for black people have a much easier time getting published in mainstream, respected, prestigious outlets like the New York Times or the Atlantic. Well, the Atlantic is better with this and getting better with this, I think. But the truth is that Quillette, where I publish, is not viewed as prestigious as these big gatekeepers like the New York Times, and especially not among liberal elites who have a disproportionate share of the cultural power. So I think we're all on some level prestige-seeking animals. This is a point about evolutionary psychology, and where there's more prestige to be gained, people will be psychologically incentivized to go there and disincentivized from going where there's prestige to be lost. So I'm a publishing for Colette and pointing out the kind of making the kind of arguments I make. I might get attacked as a hack, or a charlatan, but you're less likely to get attacked on a big platform as being a charlatan if you're publishing in the New York Times and publishing about how systemic racism is the biggest problem facing Black people, even if that's a position that's hard to justify with the evidence.
Why is it that these publications that have more prestige are more likely to publish one view over another?
Well, I think Shelby Steele, who is a really great Black writer who's been writing about these topics for decades, I think he basically put his finger on why this is. He has two books, one called White Guilt and Shame, another called Shame, both of which are great. And he argues that basically what happened in the 1960s is that mainstream white America finally recognized and admitted to its wrongdoing. It admitted to the fact that separate but equal was a lie. It was a false promise, that the system was really and had been for the centuries since slavery rigged against Black people, and that no significant efforts had been made to remedy this. This was what the civil rights movement was. It was an absolutely winning moral movement that forced America to own up to its sins, essentially. And basically what happened at this moment was obviously that was necessary, but it had this long-term, probably unforeseeable at the time, effect of delegitimizing mainstream institutions in America. And the best analogy I can think to give is not an analogy Shelby Steele gives, but it's sort of like a moment where, as an adolescent, you realize that one or both of your parents is a deeply flawed person, right? Because up till now, you're thinking of them as a moral authority. You just have this naive view of your mom or dad as someone who deserves to be respected, even when you disagree with them. So when they tell you to get home at 11 p.m., you begrudgingly do it. And then you realize that your dad has been, I don't know, evading taxes or cheating on his wife, whatever. You realize that he has no moral authority to tell you what to do. And now you feel like you don't have to listen to him, right? That is roughly the analogy I'm giving here, or roughly the picture Shelby Steele paints, is that starting in the 60s, after the civil rights movement, any American institution, whether it's government, whether it's Ivy League colleges, the police, all the moral legitimacy that they were assumed to have was wiped out as long as they were considered racist. It was now the onus is on any institution to prove a negative, to prove that it is not racist. So you see this all over our society now, where an institution has to prove positively how much it is doing to combat racism within the institution before you have to prove that it's racist to begin with. And it's a problem of moral capital, which is just like how much moral legitimacy is an institution viewed as having. And now it's the case that if you're not doing a lot to combat racism, you're just viewed as a morally bankrupt institution, and people don't have to listen to you. And I think that more or less explains why you see so many mainstream outlets promoting certain voices and not others.
That makes me think of, I feel like this is starting to spread into even like the market a little bit. I feel like you see a lot of companies now coming out against not necessarily the issue of race, but a lot of other issues when it's kind of like, okay, I mean, like, you didn't have to do that, but great. Like, good to know that you're for this or that. Great, and I think some people have thoughts on if that's an advertising, PR thing, or if it's genuine or whatnot. But now it's getting to the point where I see some consumers get upset if a certain company or whatnot doesn't come out with a specific voice or message if something happens. But
yeah, no, I think the biggest example of this recently is obviously Kaepernick and Nike. I think that like that example for me, it signals that it is profitable for a massive company like Nike to take the basically far left position on police violence. The idea that there's an open season on black men in this country, which is not at all justified by the evidence. But it's profitable for Nike, or at the very least, they break even by endorsing that, which shows to me how widespread those beliefs are, or how mainstreamed once radical views now are.
Yeah. I mean, and it's funny. It's because it's all very new. Like that just happened a couple weeks ago. I think a lot of people just kind of, it's happening. We'll see where it goes. This is why I think like your perspective and hearing different perspectives on this issue is so interesting, because you, from what I can tell, you do seem to be pretty fact and statistic based. So I'm looking forward to jumping into that.
The other interesting thing about the Nike case is that Nike, it's the kind of corporation, something like, I've seen a statistic, like something like 2% of its revenue goes to its assembly line workers. This is the kind of institution that you would expect to get heavily criticized from a anti-business perspective, from an anti-free market perspective, anti-worker exploitation perspective, classic far-left economic perspectives. This is the kind of evil global capitalist organization that the far left is supposed to hate. And yet they judge it to be in their profit to agree with the far left on police violence, which I think that's an irony. That there's some irony there. But yeah, there are other companies. There's the CEO, a hot top executive at Netflix got fired over the summer for saying the N-word. I don't know if you remember this story.
I heard of it, but yeah, please.
Yeah, he was in a meeting about offensive words in Netflix's comedy specials. So presumably like what they want to do with comedians who are saying expletives. And it's I imagine it's hard to have that meeting without saying the words. So he's having that meeting.
Yeah.
He says the N-word, referring to the word itself, not to any person, right? Fired. No, there's no one cares about context. It's just, it doesn't matter. And then a month earlier, Papa John's, the CEO of Papa John's, said the N-word in an anti-racist context, recalling what it was like for him to grow up in the South around racists and hear how they would refer to black people, right? So he's quoting people from his youth disapprovingly. Quoting racists from his
That's
youth,
what that was.
right?
To be honest, I knew of the controversy. I know he got fired and that whole thing. I didn't know that that was the detail. That's
what ultimately got him fired. And they took his name off of the gym of his local hometown. Just erased him. I think that's incredibly silly, but like you said, it is, the assumption is that any institution is racist, and the onus is on you to prove that you're not.
Wow. On this note, can I ask your thoughts on the N-word? It's an incredibly sensitive topic. Clearly people are getting fired over it just by saying a word, regardless of the context. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think clearly we have an unjustifiable and irrational level of discomfort with the N-word. I mean, the only reason I'm saying N-word rather than the word now is because I've been on other YouTube shows where people get demonetized if this word is said, and I don't want to.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, but I mean, there's a whole Wikipedia page. Here, I'm not going to say the N-word. I'm saying a different word that
even
has
if you do, we
nothing
could
to do,
bleep it out.
Has nothing to do with the N-word. The word is niggardly. It is spelled Naggardly, and it's a synonym for stingy that is linguistically completely unrelated to the N-word, right? There's a Wikipedia page dedicated only to scandals around this word because it sounds kind of like the N-word, right? scandals where people have gotten fired from their jobs over saying this word, not even the N-word.
So no connection whatsoever.
No, this is a word that was around in England in the year 1000 before they had ever seen a black person.
And people
So-
are getting fired.
Yes. There was an aide who got aide to the mayor in Washington D.C. got fired for using the word in 1999, I think. And there's a whole Wikipedia page just dedicated to the list of scandals that have cropped up around this word. I think that, like, if that's not a signal that we are hypersensitive about this word, then I don't know what would be.
Well, why is this word so much more sensitive than other racial slurs, do you think?
Well, I think it's an understandable response to the unique history of racial terror around black people in this country. It's similar to what I expect you might find around conversations about Jews in Germany, for example. There's probably, I don't know this for a fact, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a level of sensitivity that from a non-German perspective might seem like, okay, that's a bit much. But you can understand, given the cultural, historical context, why that's the case. So yeah, a lot of the style of my argument is, I'm acknowledging that all of the irrationality that we have around race is understandable given slavery and Jim Crow. It's understandable that it's a laudable sentiment to want to fix history or to want to be extra sensitive to people viewed as history's victims. But this comes at a great cost. Not only are innocent people being fired, but there are all kinds of issues that are real issues facing black people that can't be mentioned because they're seen as confirming historical stereotypes. They're seen as being on the wrong side of history. One simple example is homicide is the leading cause of death among black men aged 15 to 34. Is CDC data.
The leading cause.
The leading cause. It's not the leading cause of death for white men, Hispanic men, Asian men, any other racial or age group. Why haven't we heard about this very much in the New York Times? The reason is because to talk about that problem honestly is to acknowledge that that problem is not caused by living white people. And the problem is almost entirely a problem of black men killing other black men at rates that would be shocking to people were it any other race. So to talk about that problem honestly and the consequences of that problem and the remedies requires you to, in many people's views at least, endorse a stereotype about black men as violent. When you obviously, you to talk about it in a nuanced way, you don't have to endorse that stereotype as being true. But the price we pay for this irrational reverence for history is that we can't solve problems facing black people today in a way that is in touch with the evidence. And so yes, all of this, the problems I'm pointing to are understandable. I understand why they're problems, and it's not that the people who have this kind of reverence for black history at all costs are evil or stupid. It's just there's a dominant narrative that one pays a price for going against.
So your thought, and this is interesting to me because I don't know much, I haven't heard this perspective too much, but your thought is that a lot of this has to do with white guilt?
Yes, I do. I'm not, yes.
The difficulty around having this conversation, because it's almost impossible to have.
It's almost impossible to have. It is the analogy with which John McWhorter and others like Andrew Sullivan have made to religion and Christianity in particular is useful because you have this notion of original sin. It's a sin that can never be totally redeemed. Everyone is born with it, and white guilt is kind of analogous to that, because you can't get rid of being, once you're white your whole life, barring any transracial, surgery. You just are white, and you have that moral stain upon you, or many people view it that way. And just like as a Christian, you have to go to church every Sunday to remind yourself of what a sinner you are. When you're white and you're liberal and trying to be fully in touch with the history of racial oppression, it's not enough to learn the history once. You have to learn it over and over again. This is why I read the New York Times every day, and I hardly go a week or 2 weeks without reading something about the history of racial oppression in this country. In the past several months, I've read several pieces about the history of lynching. Right? Lynching is a decades-old crime at this point. It doesn't happen anymore. And yet, I read about lynching far more often than I read about the homicide problem. Right? I think there are two kinds of history. There's a secular history, which is, you go to your class or you read a history book about World War I, you learn all the facts, learn the opposing perspectives, and then when you're done with it, you're done with it. Then there's a religious way of looking at history where it's not enough to learn it. You have to repeat it over and over and over. And I think Black history in this country, it's almost squarely in the religious history category at this point. So yeah, that is connected to white guilt and original sin and various.
That's interesting. So, because I was going to ask you why it was that African American communities tend to be so connected to their history more than other racial groups that also have oppressive histories as well. And so you're saying that because it's kind of parts of the history, if I have you correct, parts of the history are repeated over and over and over, and this is what people are learning.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think. You see this to an extent in the Jewish community too, with the Holocaust. You have the never forget meme. There's something similar to that, and it's totally understandable, because one should never forget the atrocities of history. How can you learn from them if you don't learn about them? But there's a difference between learning a piece of history and absorbing its implications for the present and reiterating it ad nauseum, just as a mechanism of prodding white people and keeping them as guilty as possible, keeping them remembering, keeping Emmett Till's corpse right in the front view of every conversation, metaphorically speaking, so that if now I'm going to disagree with a white person on race, it's not just that we're having a disagreement between two rational people, it's I have the weight of history on my side here, and all of the empathy that comes along with that. And so if I'm arguing with a white person and they're telling me that they think black on black crime is a problem, and I say, how dare you? Don't you know about slavery? Don't you know about Jim Crow? I mean, how can you reduce this to a problem of black men killing each other? And I just invoke the entire history of racial terror. That is it seems in many people's eyes to be a conversation-winning move. But it's actually not. It's actually a bad move, because history doesn't give you the answer to present-day problems in any straightforward way.
Well, let's jump into that, because in your piece, Black American Culture and the Racial Wealth Gap, you essentially talk about this and in saying that you believe that culture is one of the major factors to the racial wealth gap. Whereas a lot of other people would say systemic racism rooted in oppressive history. I would love to go over these two arguments. We're already talking about, America's history with race and racism. We obviously are familiar with slavery. We have there were the Jim Crow era and redlining, which, to be perfectly honest, I wasn't totally familiar with the details. Do you mind if we jump into that for a little bit?
Redlining?
Redlining, even Jim Crow. I know the very basics, but I don't know if there's more that one should know.
Yeah, well, redlining is especially relevant to wealth accrual because before World War II, there were various, even white ethnic groups that essentially couldn't get mortgage loans. The Irish and the Italians, they were not viewed as like white Protestants were. They're viewed as very much as outgroups. And but after World War II, there was this period where white ethnic groups like Irish and Italians were brought into the fold, allowed to get mortgage loans, and there was the Federal Housing Administration, I think the FHA. It linked banks in this way so as to spread the risk and make it much easier for the average person to get a mortgage loan. And what happens is you come back from World War II. There's this system set up to give you a loan to get your first house. The house rapidly appreciates in value. You can sell that house and use the money to put money down for the next house. You leave that house to your kids. That acts as a kind of Kickstarter for their career and a safety net for them. And black people were basically left out of this whole scheme from after World War II until the Civil Rights Movement, roughly. So that is something that's clearly relevant to the racial wealth gap, because there's just this period where it was uniquely easy to build wealth that kind of bypassed black people. So yeah, I haven't anywhere disputed those historical facts, but I've disputed the degree to which that is explanatory of the entire wealth gap. There's a 10-to-1 wealth gap. Average white household has 10 times as much wealth as the average black household, but the income gap isn't nearly that big. It's something like $1 to 60 cents, right? Not even twice. So 10-to-1 wealth gap, that's a huge wealth gap. Mm-hmm. And I was pointing to other factors that are more liable to being changed, because we can't go back and undo redlining, no matter how much we should want to.
Well, some people might suggest the idea of reparations.
Yeah. So yeah, that's an idea. My position on reparations is I'm never going to turn down a free check. It would be money in my pocket, given that my ancestors were slaves here. But I don't see any way in which simple cash transfers are going to solve any of the underlying problems causing black underachievement.
You mentioned on that note something along the lines of, if it just had to do with cash, then the government would be the ideal solution. But seeing what happened with the welfare expansion of the 1960s, you don't think that that's a good solution?
Yeah, no. There was billions of dollars of worth of cash transfers in the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty in the 60s and 70s, and this coincided precisely with the explosion of violent crime, especially in the black community, the explosion of single parent homes. Which was not, it was not a problem more or less pre-1960 in the black community. There's no reason to believe that, reparations is a misnomer because it implies that cash transfers would repair. There's no reason to believe that's true. I should get into why I think that's true, because culture, black American culture is not the same as certainly white elite culture or Asian American culture.
Yeah, that's what
obviously these are huge generalizations for which you could find many exceptions, but it's nevertheless true that behavioral patterns and values that are inculcated are different in different groups. And in black kids routinely get accused of acting white in school if they take too much of an interest in school, if they're smart. There's a social disincentive on doing well in school in a way that I would argue is probably flips in the other direction. For example, in the Asian American community, I don't know that. I'm certainly never heard of an Asian American kid saying that they got teased for not being Asian enough because they were doing too well in school. And yet the testimony from black kids, including myself, including Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, Jay-Z, Chance the Rapper, have all talked about this phenomenon, and there are like a dozen ethnographic studies that have found this to be widespread. It's there is a taboo on scholarly achievement, and especially in the middle school and high school years. That has massive implications. You find black households with this at the same socioeconomic level have fewer books in the home than white households. Brookings Institution has surveyed kids, asking them how much homework they do per night. You find Asian American kids spend twice as much time on homework as white kids. White kids spend much more time on homework than black kids. And these are all cultural phenomena. Like, how does reparations fix that? It's not clear to me. And the other aspects I pointed out in that piece was Nielsen, the market research firm, has a lot of consumer spending data, and has found that the average black woman is more likely to own a luxury vehicle than the average white woman, which is rather shocking because given the racial wealth gap, you would expect the opposite to be the case, right? But it is the case that more likely to buy a luxury vehicle, more likely to buy jewelry, even expensive jewelry. And this is a point that has been made comedically by Dave Chappelle in one of his old skits, and I don't think he came under very much fire for it, but unfortunately I'm not as funny as Dave Chappelle, no matter how much I try to be. But
You're young.
Give me a few years.
Yeah.
The point is, all of these differences are highly relevant. Like the cardinal sin, in my view, the mistake to make is to look at a statistical disparity in some outcome, whether it's college graduation or income or wealth, and to assume that the groups you're comparing have the same behavioral patterns, so that whatever outcome that's disparate, it must be the case that somewhere along the line there is some kind of system, whether it's overt or not, that is discriminating against one or the other. There's no reason to believe. I mean, that it could be the case that some of that is true, but it certainly doesn't explain most of the phenomenon, in my view.
What exactly is systemic racism?
So I think that systemic racism is the idea that any given system in America, or anywhere on Earth for that matter, it can be the case that there are no racist people along the chain from, say, kindergarten to college, right? That there are no consciously racist individuals, but the system can still spit out racially disparate outcomes. That it's racism without the racists. And it's a very common view nowadays that this is the case, everywhere from the police to job hiring and housing and whatnot. And it's a very complicated picture. There's so much data to wade through, but there is a kind of big picture way to test this hypothesis, which is to compare the outcomes of Black Americans to the outcomes of West Indian blacks. What West Indian blacks tend to be from Jamaica, Barbados, other places in the West Indies, and they migrate to this country and they have children that are indistinguishable from Black Americans. You wouldn't be able to tell if I was the son of a Jamaican immigrant or
the descendant of a slave.
Exactly. So it's basically a crude science experiment, right? Is what you're holding equal in these two groups is whatever amount of systemic racism there is in society. Because the police can't tell the difference between them, employers can't tell the difference, speak the same roughly, look very similar. Indeed, West Indian blacks tend to be a bit darker skinned. So from a colorism perspective, they should even be getting treated worse. But what you find is that in 1970s, census data showed that in the city of New York, second generation West Indians earned 58% higher incomes than American blacks and 15% higher than the national average generally.
So they do really well.
Yes, they do very well. And that's been the case for decades. And in the same exact cities, there was this study that was widely circulated about the wealth gap that found that the average black Bostonian had $8 to his or her name in terms of wealth, which is shocking. This was reported as obviously racist. The same study finds that the average black Bostonian of West Indian descent had $12,000. So the same city,
Wow.
same exact city, subjected to the same level of systemic racism to the extent that it exists in Boston, wildly different outcomes. There's also this Columbia sociologist, Van Tran, who has done great work on this, comparing neighborhoods in New York with black Americans to neighborhoods right next to them with black West Indians, equally segregated from the white communities around them. And you see a totally different pattern of college enrollment, high school graduation, two-parent homes, crime. And again, this is not to say that these groups are perfectly comparable in every way, because there are immigration selection effects. So like the immigrants who get to this country from Barbados and Jamaica tend to be the cream of the crop of those countries. So it's not, in that case, it's not strictly analogous, but what is held equal is systemic racism. So if systemic racism were a deep barrier to success, whatever amount of systemic racism exists or doesn't, it should be the case that black West Indians are doing much worse than they are in fact doing, right? So that's a big picture way to test it. I mean, ultimately, so that's fine.
Yeah, and you think that that's because of culture?
Largely because of culture. It is true of the literature and anecdotally true that black West Indians have different cultural priors than black Americans in many ways. So yeah, more socially conservative, more likely to have two-parent homes, more likely to, the taboo on educational achievement is not there. It's much more of a immigrant mindset. It's much more analogous to what you find among Asian immigrants, for example, very focused on success. Yeah.
Now, why do you think that your findings on Black American culture, you're talking about the acting white, you're talking about the spending. I think you also write about, on this note about culture, you also talk about, crime. You brought up crime. Like, where do you think this comes from? This notion to have this culture, really, like.
Culture is a bit mysterious. I mean, there are many hypotheses. I mean, Thomas Sowell has this great essay entitled "Black Rednecks and White Liberals," in which he argues that before emancipation, something like 90% of black people lived in the South and were slaves and absorbed the culture of the white South around them, which was very, compared to the North, white Southerners were deeply anti-intellectual, not as, were notoriously lazy compared to white Northerners, and had all of these kind of backwards cultural elements that they had gotten from Scotland. And one of his arguments is that that kind of culture seeped in the South and had long-term implications, whereas in the Black West Indies, they were slaves there too, but slaves there were allowed to be entrepreneurial in a way that slaves in the South were not, because there were virtually no white people around in the West Indian colonies. Just there was an overseer, but they were just extraction colonies, and slaves had to do everything for themselves to survive, grow their own food, for example, whereas not true of the South. So very different historical circumstances, structural circumstances that can have long cultural consequences. That's one hypothesis. It's not to say that's the only explanation. I mean, some cultural features are just, in my view, more or less straightforward consequences of historical racism. For example, the crime problem in the black community. Eugenics was a mainstream ideology across the political spectrum in the beginning of the 20th century.
What is eugenics?
Eugenics being the idea that we need to prevent the, quote, genetically inferior members of society from reproducing and promote reproduction among the genetically superior member of society in order to improve the species. So it was taken as mainstream among progressives on the left and conservatives on the right in the early 20th century that black people were inferior and should be encouraged to not reproduce for the betterment of humanity. And this is a period when police forces are also ramping up and taking their modern form. So what happened is that, or at least one thing that happened, is that white communities got the benefit of policing where black communities didn't. The attitude was, if there's violence in the black community, we'll basically let them kill each other as a form of population control. Whereas if there's violence in, say, the Irish community, we're going to crack down on it and make those communities safe. So what happens is that in the absence of a police force, the natural state of any human group, regardless of race, is for young men to compete for status through violence. And the black community did not get the benefit of policing in the same way. So a culture of honor, a culture where every young man is incentivized to take revenge on the person who killed his friend or brother.
Which is what you see in a lot of gangs right now.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes. So that the way I view it is that if an alien came from Mars and just studied the past 10,000 years of human history, they would find the rate of homicide and violence in Chicago and in St. Louis and South Central LA. They would find that to be more typical. And they would find that the really low rates of violence in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or really nice suburbs, they would find that to be the phenomenon to be explained. And the way it's explained is that is good and effective policing, which the black community has historically lacked, largely for reasons of racism, and in some ways still lacks, because there is in many high crime communities, there's an over policing of drug offenses and an under policing of violent offenses, where a murder of a black person is less likely to be solved than a murder of a white person by a significant degree. So what that does is now, my cousin was killed and I can't count on the police to solve it. So who am I if I don't retaliate? That's the culture that has been allowed to thrive in high crime communities of color. That was so I mean, yeah, ultimately every feature of culture that I want to talk about has a historical explanation for how it got there. And it's a historical explanation that doesn't imply that anyone is to blame, right? I mean, the problem here is that people feel you're blaming victims by invoking cultural explanations. This is not what I'm doing. Blame is totally irrelevant to this conversation. Like no one is to blame for the culture that they accidentally were born into. No one chooses where they're born. No one chooses the values that are inculcated on mother's knee. None of choice and blame are totally irrelevant to this picture. So
you talk about the parable of the pedestrian. Is that what it was?
Yeah,
about?
yeah. The parable of the pedestrian is a parable by the legal scholar Amy Wax. And it goes like this. Imagine that there's a pedestrian that is hit by a car and injured. Their spine is injured. And they go to the ER, the doctors do what they can, and when they wake up, they're told, the only way for you to fix this, there's no surgery, we just don't have the surgery. The only way for you to fix this is to go to physical therapy for 2 years every day. And in that context, that pedestrian might feel, well, this is ridiculous. Why is it on me to fix this, right? It should be on the driver. I should be getting damages. The driver should be making me whole. He's the one that hit me, which is true. Mm-hmm. But just make the driver Bill Gates, so that if there were a surgery that cost $1 billion, he could cover it. There just is no surgery. There's just nothing that exists. The only cure is for the pedestrian to work. As unfair as that is, right? It's not victim blaming in that context to say you're the one that has to do this, even though you're not the one that caused the problem. So this analogy is to any feature of Black culture that at this point is counterproductive and leading to bad outcomes that wasn't caused by Black people. It may have been caused by slavery, caused by Jim Crow. But it's not just the person who causes something is not often able to fix it, or not always able to fix it. And this is loops back to reparations before. Like, mm-hmm. How is reparations going to fix the taboo on academic achievement? No, I mean that's a problem that has to have an internal, bottom-up solution, even if it's a problem that was created by white people in the past.
Right. Well, for this one in particular, I've heard that it's harder for Blacks to speak in education, to move up the education ladder, because it's harder with single mothers at home to watch after the kids, to make sure they do the homework, because they have to work so many jobs, because husbands are incarcerated at rates higher than other races. What would you say to that? Essentially just culture, again?
Well, I guess if you...
Because I know it's a lot there.
Yeah, it's a lot there, but the first causal link in that chain mm-hmm. was Black men are incarcerated. Mm-hmm. So that's, the assumption being that's why they can't be fathers at the same rate. There's truth to that, but again, to frame it as Black men are incarcerated more, the flip side is that Black men commit crime more, right? Like 52% of the murders in this country for the most recent year available were committed by Blacks, yet we make up 14% of the population. The victimization rate for homicide is 6 times higher for Blacks than whites. This is a problem that obviously, like I said at the beginning, it seems to confirm stereotypes that are deeply uncomfortable. But it's a problem that is disproportionately suffered by Black people. When it comes to two-parent homes, it is true to say that from emancipation until 1960, roughly, the rate of two-parent homes was not that different between Blacks and whites. The skyrocketing rate of single motherhood is a problem that started in the 60s and was exacerbated through the 70s and 80s and has remained with us and is even now starting to affect the white working class as well. But if racism is a straightforward explanation for the single-parent home problem, it would make no sense, because racism was much worse in 1950, but the single-parent home problem is much worse today. So the trend lines are going in
So
opposite.
What happened there? I know before we had mentioned it happening around the same time as the welfare expansion.
Yeah. I think the welfare expansion had something to do with it, but I don't think it was the only or the main cause. I think it's a very complex issue, and there's a lot of scholarly dispute about it. But One explanation is that it was just the cultural upheaval of the 60s with regard to sex and marriage had more of an effect on the black community. And the welfare piece is that, like, in the late 60s, there were many cases in which a mother on welfare would lose money if she got married. But because of the way welfare rules were set up, you literally would lose money for your kids. Your welfare check would shrink if you did one thing, which is get married. So with those incentives and the main driving problem of the cultural upheaval, the decline of shotgun marriages as a concept. So I don't want to be reductionist about it. I think it could be the case. It could be one of those problems that has 20 different small causes. But yeah, I mean, it's a problem that is, it's not obvious how one solves that or if it can be solved, unfortunately.
What do you think about affirmative action? I imagine probably about the same as reparations, right?
Yeah, I mean, affirmative action is, well, just to be clear, I find affirmative action as a term to be so misleading because it is a policy of racial discrimination straightforwardly. It is taking someone's skin color into account and judging them by a different standard, treating them differently on that basis. Straightforward example of a racially discriminatory policy, and would be recognized as such to someone with someone not from our culture would see that and think, oh, that's what the definition of racial discrimination is. So the question with affirmative action is, what are we getting that is so valuable that it's worth discriminating based on race? It's possible that diversity is such a good thing. It's so good to have racially diverse faces on a college campus that it's worth it. I'm open to that possibility. But there are a few myths about it that need to be openly discussed, which is that it's very helpful for the black community. It's to whatever degree it's helpful, it's only helpful to people like myself, for example, that don't really need the help. Like, affirmative action makes my life easier because it means when I'm applying to some program or some college, the standards are lowered for me and people like me, black people like me. It doesn't do almost anything for the members of the black community who most lag behind, the disconnected class, people who don't have a job, who aren't in school. It's totally a policy that helps middle and upper middle class people who, not to say that need no help, but who least need help in the black community. Right? Like if you're worried about whether you're getting into Harvard or not, you're doing fine.
You're doing pretty well.
You're doing fine. The second thing is that there's a fair degree of evidence at this point that taking a person who scores 1,200 on the SAT, well, I guess it's out of 2,400 now.
I was gonna say I don't even know what they're out of anymore.
I think they're out of 2,400 now. So taking a person who scored 1,800 on the SAT, a black kid, and putting them, because of affirmative action, into a school where the average SAT score is 2,100 is not necessarily good for them. There have been studies where, I think there was one at Duke that found that something like 70% of black kids came in wanting to do a STEM degree at Duke, and by the time they graduated, half of them had switched to less rigorous degrees. Wow. Where the attrition rate for other groups was virtually not at all. Everyone who came in doing STEM, wanting to do STEM, did STEM. And the straightforward cause of this is just that you're putting them in a class, the professor's teaching to the middle of the class, and everyone in the class is at a higher level than that. There was another one, there was a study in the 80s of black students at MIT that found that while they were in the top 5% of math scores in the whole nation, they were in the bottom 5% of math scores at MIT. This is a straightforward consequence of affirmative action, right? Imagine what it's like to be one of the smartest math students in the country by any objective standard, but not quite MIT smart, at MIT feeling stupid in every class, right? Profoundly demoralizing, wasting years and perhaps money. I mean, this is the kind of consideration that is just not at all taken seriously by people who otherwise claim to have black people's best interests at heart. So it's not at all obvious that it's been a net good for black people. I think the evidence is very mixed. And going forward, we have to reckon with how we are treating other groups. I mean, there's this class action lawsuit that some Asian students are bringing against Harvard that has been obviously discriminating against them at this point for decades. And the degree to which there's just very little sympathy.
Can we talk about that for a second?
Yeah, sure.
What is
yeah.
You talk about the differences in the SAT scores, how much higher their standards are.
Yeah, there was a study by the Princeton sociologist Thomas Espenshade in 2009, which found that the average Asian student had to score 450 points higher on the SAT than the average black student to have the same odds of getting into elite colleges. That's a massive gap.
Yeah, it really
That's a
is.
massive premium you're putting on being black and a massive penalty you're putting on happening to be born Asian. And it's just, it's unclear to me that it's not obvious that affirmative action is so good, so essential, that we need to be making Asian kids score 450 points higher than blacks to get into the same schools. I don't think that's sustainable. And the evidence of how amazing affirmative action is for black people has not been forthcoming. What schools have been reduced to doing, and college presidents and administrators, is just to lie and hide data, right? Because if they just hide all of the data relevant to adjudicating the wisdom of this policy, if it were that good, if it were so obviously good, like university presidents and administrators could just release the data on GPA scores of their black students by major, and they would say, listen, all of our look, it's right here. All of our black kids they're doing just as good as whites and Asians. They don't really they keep this data extremely close to the vest because it's just it would be too much of a I guess political nightmare for them, and it would undermine many of the assumptions about how good affirmative action is for black people.
Is that you that writes about, there was one study done a little while ago where they found out that some big chunk of black students in Ivy League schools were West Indian blacks, and that once that study came out, they stopped releasing. Was that you?
Yeah,
that was you?
Yeah, this was in 2004. Henry Louis Gates and Lonnie Guinier, two black professors at Harvard, did a study of Harvard's black students and found that 2/3 of them were either immigrants, the children of immigrants, or to a lesser extent, biracial. When that cohort makes up like 10% of America's black people. So 10% of black Americans were making up like 2/3 of black Harvard students. So that the reason that there's been no data
After that, they stopped releasing data.
I have not seen a single data point on West Indians in the Ivy League since 2004, because it is, I guess it's politically inconvenient on multiple fronts. One being that it certainly deflates the logic of systemic racism again, because if it's that why are West Indians doing so well if systemic racism is such a big problem? And the second way it's deflationary is that the supposed boon of affirmative action is being felt more by immigrants than by the people it was intended to help, which was the descendants of American slaves.
Right. That, and what we were talking about, the redlining, the Jim Crow, the people taking advantage of this benefit, their ancestors didn't go through those.
Right. Exactly. Not at all. They have no connection to American slavery. But it's interesting because when affirmative action first when it was first conceived, it was very much conceived as a reparations project. It was conceived as a way of giving something back to black people because so much had been taken from them. Over the years, the goalposts have shifted because since there's virtually no evidence that it's really good for black people, the goalpost has shifted to diversity, which is
You hear that
now it's
every day.
now it's less about reparation and more about diversity, because the reparation rationale, the evidence was just so weak that it was fulfilling that goal. I think, at least.
Why do you think someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates says using the argument of culture is lazy?
Again, it's ironically his argument for that is so bare bones that his argument for that is so lazy that I don't even know how to combat it. I don't see anything lazy about it. I think he probably just views it as a cop out, but I've never seen him seriously grapple with. I mean, I've seen him try to explain away the single parent home problem in a way that was really not dealing with the statistics there. But no, I mean it's I don't know what to say other than it's not lazy. I mean, culture. I mean, so Harvard sociologist Orlando Patterson and another Harvard sociologist, William Julius Wilson, both black, have written quite a bit about race, and they're some of the only sociologists that have taken very seriously the hypothesis that culture in itself is a factor that can explain other things rather than an epiphenomenon, just a mere consequence of other things that can't itself be a primary cause of outcomes. So there are two people that have taken it seriously. Patterson, I think it's fair to say, believes that culture is a primary causal phenomenon. William Julius Wilson emphasizes culture less. But they've both said that there's this massive taboo among academics, among sociologists, about even entertaining the hypothesis that culture is the cause of something. I think one of them called it the C word somewhere, ironically or sarcastically.
Oh, jeez.
And it was like a sociologist. You're a sociologist. If you're not going to study culture, who is? Right? I mean, you would think it's a paradox
you're
that
right.
sociologists, for the most part, aren't willing to entertain the hypothesis that the culture of societies or social groups which they study has consequences.
Yeah, you're right. That's literally in the name of their job
It is,
description.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So there is I mean, people like John Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, who've written a lot about the problem of ideological siloing in research in colleges.
I'm sorry, ideological.
The orthodoxy, let's say, ideological orthodoxy, the fact that so many professors lean left and there's so few professors that lean right. I think there's some statistic, like in the top 60 elite colleges, there are like 44 left-leaning sociologists for every one right-leaning sociologist. So you can imagine that the literature just from the beginning is skewed, right? The way I know this is because in my piece, Black American Culture and the Racial Wealth Gap, I pointed out statistics that are publicly available, easily searchable on Google, namely that the average black woman is more likely to have a luxury vehicle. I've never seen a sociologist who talks about the wealth gap mention this. You would think this would be widely known or at least widely talked about, but someone like me who just has, a college student with an internet connection who reads, I come out with it, and people, people are treating me as if I've discovered this thing. In a way, I did, but I really didn't. I mean, the thing is, people were just not willing in academia to look for these kinds of facts, or once they're found, to talk about them. So there's just this enormous gap in the literature, and so few people within academia willing to talk about it. So yes, I guess, what was the question?
I think I was originally asking you about Ta-Nehisi Coates saying that
Yeah.
using culture is lazy, and
Yeah, I mean, but yeah, part of the problem is just that academics are not, academia is broken in terms of the range of hypotheses that are allowed to be entertained. So if you're a curious person who is wading in to the problem of racial disparities, and you just look for what the mainstream takes among respected academics are, you might find Orlando Patterson, who has entertained the hypothesis of black culture, but you'll also find 60 other sociologists who treat the phrase black culture like it's a swear word. So you're gonna assume naively that it's more or less it's more or less the consensus of experts that culture has nothing to do with it.
Why do you think that is? This is kind of going off topic. I know this is kind of going into academia and what you call the ideological
Orthodoxy.
Oh, okay. With the ratio so high, 44-1, sociologists leaning left. Why is that? And I mean, are people voicing concern about that?
Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, who just wrote a book called The Coddling of the American Mind, which is excellent and I highly recommend. Yeah, they're bringing attention to this issue because they're concerned that research suffers when there's only a narrow range of opinions you're allowed to have, which is obviously true. We need people to be fighting it out with evidence, and that's how consensus emerges, not just one half of the political spectrum voicing its academic opinions. I don't know. It's a complex story. I've heard smart people say that in the 60s and 70s, conservative intellectuals kind of retreated to think tanks because academia was increasingly hostile to them, and that's just compounded.
I think Christina Hoff Sommers kind of mentioned something similar for feminism in academia at that time.
Yeah, I think a similar dynamic for race issues. Yeah, I mean, I don't know the full story historically of how it came to be the case that elite universities are so hostile to conservative ideas.
Do you think it has something to do with what you were mentioning earlier about kind of institutional guilt?
Yeah, that could be true. Yeah, there could be a link there. Yeah, it could be that institutions came under the presumption of racism so fully that it just became harder and harder to
swung the other side.
Yeah.
Isn't there something out there with a German guilt? I have no idea what the details are, but I've heard that or actually I think I heard that in relation to the immigrant situation that's happening in Germany and Europe right now, was saying that Germany in particular, one of the reasons why they're so open is because of this guilt of the past.
That makes sense.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about a few other really common grievances that we hear, because I think for our viewers, I don't think they get to hear this side very often compared to what else is in the media. We were talking about, crime earlier, and I thought it was interesting that you said that Black communities are under-policed and badly policed. Mm-hmm. Right now, there's a narrative out there that they're over-policed. So I think that's interesting. What do you think about the police brutality issue that's going on right now?
Well, yeah, I would say they are over-policed with respect to drug crime. But that's where people tend to keep the focus. They're under-policed with respect to violent crime. And that's a straightforward reading of the data on clearance rates, which is the technical term for how likely a murder is to be solved. With respect to police brutality,
why is that? I know back you were saying because of what was it, eugenics?
Oh yeah, well yeah, but there's this historical problem of Black communities being under-policed with homicide, but today the problem is largely, it's partially the fact that black people in black communities are less likely to trust the police, and therefore less likely to testify, and convicting murderers is deeply reliant on eyewitness testimony. There's also this huge problem of once you agree to testify against someone, the police can't really protect you. Like the witness protection program, there's a huge problem with people who snitch getting killed. Jill Leovy, that LA Times journalist, has written a book about this called Ghettocide, in which she interviews all these people who, they saw the murder happen, or they know who the murderer is, but are terrified to testify because because they know someone who got killed for testifying, because it happens that frequently. So there are serious obstacles from a policing perspective. But getting back to the police brutality concern, and specifically the most inflammatory grievance is that there's an open season for police killing black men. Right? There's no reason to believe that this is true.
Yeah, I've heard things such as like being hunted down. I've seen, I think on the View, and probably a lot of other things I've seen. I think it was Sunny Hostin. She was crying after one of the shootings because she was saying she's so scared for her husband and son. So that makes me wonder what the numbers are, right? Like how many, what is this in comparison to say the black on black crime or the whole thing?
So every year, based on Washington Post data, they keep a close database of this, roughly 1,000 Americans get killed by the cops every year. Total.
Memories.
Yep. And, something like 80 or 90% of those people are armed and dangerous when they're killed, and the vast majority of those shootings are justified, right? So think about 1,000. That's roughly 3 people every day, and the reason we don't hear about this is because they're justified, right? We don't hear about 3 reports of police shootings every day because
there wouldn't be much.
Yeah, right. There it's not a story because these are largely justified shootings, and then there's this smaller group of unarmed people who get killed every year. And for black people, this is in recent years, it's ranged from 15 people per year to 30 or 40. In recent years, it's been towards the lower end. And in 2016, 2017, and 2018, there have been more white unarmed people killed than blacks. And some of those shootings are justified. Some of them are just murder. Some of them are just the most straightforward examples of police misconduct. And so there's a few.
I'm sorry. You say the numbers around 14, 15 a year
of people who get. It varies widely. It varies widely. It can be 20 per year, but it ranges between like 15 and 40 according to the Washington Post database of how many unarmed black people get killed per year. But it's more unarmed white people getting killed. So like I don't remember the specific numbers, but this year thus far more unarmed whites have been killed than unarmed blacks. And that's true in 2017, and it was true in 2016 that more unarmed whites got killed, sometimes by a factor of 2. So you don't hear this as much in the news, of course,
right? Because
it doesn't gel with the narrative that there's an open season on black people. But the argument that I usually hear at this point is, well, black people make up 14% of the population, so shouldn't they make up 14% of people who are killed instead of 25 or 30, which is the case for the out of the whole 1,000, it's something like 25% roughly are black. Like, isn't that 10% disparity evidence that there is an issue, a racial issue? That doesn't make any sense, because it's not as if the police don't go around like census collectors, right, randomly killing every 100th person, right? They're coming into contact with suspects. They're coming into contact with, they're getting calls, and they're going up to the people described in the calls and getting into altercations And if those altercations go sideways, that's when police shootings tend to happen. Black people are very overrepresented, as we've talked about, among criminals. And so you can't be surprised when police are coming into contact much more often with black people just based off the 911 calls they're getting, and they're getting into altercations with them more, right? So no, it's not evident. I mean, the fact that black people make up like 25% of total people who get killed by the police is not evidence that the police are out to get black people.
Right, because you were mentioning the 50% crime
Yeah.
being committed by black people. And
Yeah,
so,
that homicides specifically.
or I'm sorry, homicides. Yeah.
And so, like, I mean, every year for which we have data, out of the total 1,000 that get killed, it's twice as many white people as black people. Almost, sometimes twice, sometimes a little less than twice. And some people don't even know that fact.
Right. And I would assume for the same reasons we were saying before when it comes to the media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what they're incentivized to put out and not.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think just there are two pieces here where the police get rightly criticized. One is that there are just cases every year of shootings that are totally unjustified, where any reasonable consideration of justice would have this policeman or woman convicted of a crime, and they usually get off free. They have an almost automatic immunity in those cases. So that is a totally legitimate concern, and it's also legitimate to just be concerned about the total number of people being killed to begin with. It could be the case that there's some reform that we could do, some better way to train cops where we could reduce the total number. So yeah, cops kill too many people, but it's not a racial issue, right?
Right. What are your thoughts on reverse racism, or as you put in your article, the high price of stale grievances, the double standards?
Yeah, I think this is increasingly a problem, especially for our politics as a country. The way I think of it, I mean, do you remember the Sarah Jeong controversy where the New York Times hired Sarah Jeong as a writer who had a several year-long history of tweeting really vile things about white people, celebrating the fact that white people might stop breeding, for example, things that would be recognized as straightforwardly racist if they were said about black people. In fact, Candace Owens retweeted, she copy pasted Sarah Jeong's tweets, but replaced the word white with black, and got banned from Twitter almost instantly.
Wow.
And then reinstated, which I think is telling it.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I'm not saying Sarah Jeong, I think in her social context, those kind of tweets are not to be read as statements of eugenic intent, or there's a kind of coded language that they far left social justice warriors kind of use as more of a signal of their wokeness rather than a commitment to exterminating white people. But the problem is that if you're sort of a typical middle America white person who watches Fox News and you voted for Trump, maybe you don't like everything about him, but and you're watching Fox News and you see New York Times hires writer who has said that she wants white people to stop breeding, and New York Times did not apologize for this. Think nope. You just have to imagine how that reads to the typical white person who perhaps has concerns about immigration, about a changing country, and the way in which they feel that there's nothing left for them on the left, right? Like at this point, you have the biggest left-wing newspaper, the most respected, hiring a person who is just shamelessly hiring a person without apology who just said the most vile things about people that look like you. And this is a huge problem for our politics. I mean, you have to wonder why so many people are Trump supporters who know that Trump lies a lot. They know that he's a scummy person, but they don't care because look at the alternative. I mean, the alternative is just a half of the political spectrum that celebrates their non-existence. That's a problem politically that is only getting worse and worse. And I think it's just we have to be willing to call out anti-white racism, and we can't settle for redefining the word racism.
I was going to ask, because I've heard people say there's no such thing as reverse racism.
Yes, that is the most. I mean, imagine like you could do this with any word. You could let's just redefine the word murder to only mean when you kill a black person. We could do that. We could just decide to come up with a different word, but you can't change the underlying ethical status of an action by redefining it, right? Like racism, you just call it something else. It's still just as bad as it was yesterday when you change the terminology. So yeah, this is an incredibly silly thing that's been done with that word.
Yeah.
And it's having terrible consequences for our politics.
What do you think about the idea of inherent bias and what do they call anti-bias training?
Or you mean implicit bias?
Implicit bias. Like I know the whole Starbucks situation that happened not too long ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, implicit bias is. I mean, you take this test where that occurs on the order of milliseconds, where you're asked to associate words like good or bad with black or white faces. You can do this with anything. You can do it with apples and oranges, and how fast you associate one thing with a positive word versus a negative word, you get a score that sort of spits out the degree to which you're implicitly biased against one or the other. And I mean, the obvious thing to notice about these tests is that there's a reason they're done on the order of milliseconds. It's because when you expand the range to seconds, you can't find any bias.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, they wouldn't have to do it in terms of milliseconds quicker if they could find that you were biased on the order of seconds and minutes. At this point, it's mainstream, I think. It's a mainstream reading of the psychological literature that implicit bias does not predict real-world bias at all. And this has been admitted by one of the founders of the implicit bias test. Yes. That knowing someone's implicit bias score doesn't give you any predictive power as to whether they will discriminate in real life. So I mean, there's a lot of hype around this, but at this point, it's just it's been totally discredited as a method for predicting real world bias.
I mean, it's so interesting to me because countries, I mean, at least when I heard about the whole Starbucks thing, which is like, for quick context, these two black guys came into Starbucks. They were sitting there. Apparently, they didn't buy anything, and one of the workers called the cops on them to escort them out, which, caused a lot of outrage over that, saying that it was racially motivated call or whatever. But the result of that was that Starbucks closed down. What was it? They closed down.
8,000 of their stores for a day of anti-bias trainings.
Yeah, which would make me think if they're willing to lose that much money, like what is the result of this thing? Or is it just the most expensive PR campaign?
It is that. Yeah, I mean, again, there's no evidence that anti-bias training actually reduces implicit bias. So it's totally just covering their behinds.
Wow.
So, I mean, the way I look at this is in a country of 350 million people, a given something that has a 1 in a billion chance of happening to you on any given day will happen to it'll happen to someone like 3 times a week or twice a week, right? If you just look at the probability of it, a 1 in a billion chance in a country that's a third of a billion will happen to someone somewhere every third day. So as long as there's someone with an iPhone there to film it, or a journalist who's incentivized enough to publish it, it can seem like there's an epidemic of some issue when in fact there's a 1 in a billion chance of it happening to you on any given day.
Where do you get that 1 in a billion number?
Well, I'm making that number up. I'm saying if say it just is the case that you have a 1 in a billion chance of getting struck by lightning every day, then with those odds, someone will get struck by lightning in the U.S. once every 3 days, because we have that many people. So it can seem like there is that there's an outbreak of this thing happening, when in fact it's actually very rare. So, I mean, another way of looking at this is that a big problem with the way people look at racist incidents. Let's just assume the Starbucks was a racist incident. It's actually unclear that it was, but let's just assume for the sake of argument. People look at racist incidents like this with a kind of the mindset of it like a disease. Like, so think of something like smallpox. Smallpox used to be a huge issue, and it's the kind of issue where it's not enough to get rid of 90% of it or 99% of it. It really is useful to find the last person in the world with smallpox and make them not contagious, and just you never hit diminishing returns fighting something like smallpox. It really is worth it to get down to the last case. But then think of a problem like homicide, for example. Like the homicide rate in New York used to be 10 times as high as it is now in the 90s. We've gotten rid of 90% of the problem, but it's still 200 or 300 people in a city of 8 million get killed every year. What would it take to get the homicide rate in New York down to 0, right? It could be done, but it would require a completely totalitarian top-down solution, putting cameras inside of everyone's houses and marshaling the police to do nothing else but try to prevent homicide. It would be unlivable. It would not be worth it. You would hit diminishing returns trying to get the homicide rate literally down to 0. So many people view racist incidents as a kind of smallpox scenario, where it is worth it to continue fighting it down to the very last instance. Where I view it as much more like the homicide problem, where you can reduce racism and racist incidents 90%, and it could be the case that you just hit diminishing returns at a certain point, because in a country of 350 million, there will always be enough bad people to justify a few racist instances that don't indicate a trend or an epidemic. And we just have to, it's interesting that we just don't have these intuitions about homicide. Like no one is scandalized by the fact that there were 200 or 300 homicides in New York last year. But if there are a couple racist incidents at a Starbucks, it's a national scandal. No, I mean, this doesn't make any sense. They're treating it like a disease outbreak, right? Which is, in my view, the definition of a moral panic.
I think that a lot of that, I guess anyone who's not black assumes I just have to go with what I hear the black experience is like. Yeah. So. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that goes back to the issue of certain voices being promoted in the black community and others being pushed down.
Yeah. So what do you think is the future for this conversation? Because like we mentioned earlier, this is almost an impossible conversation to have. I mean, what do you think? I don't know. Are you hopeful? What are your thoughts?
I have a policy against making predictions because almost all predictions are wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what to expect. I really don't know.
Yeah.
I'm doing my best to do my part, but we'll see.
Yeah. Is there anything else about this issue that you want to get out there, you wish was out there more, but you don't see enough of?
I think we covered a
a lot.
Yeah.
We covered a lot.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you coming on and like really hashing all of this out, because your work is really, really detailed and it's really interesting. So to like have you here and explain it, I think is going to be so helpful for so many people in this conversation that you can't get as readily as a lot of other conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much for coming on. That was really great.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, anytime, really. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's 2 easy things you can do. 1, click subscribe, and 2, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.